Okay, we'll come to order. Today is Wednesday, November 17th, 2010, and this is a special joint meeting of the Planning Commission and the Transportation and Parking Commission for the City of Glendale. Could we have a roll call, please?
Present.
Here. Here.
Here.
Here. Here.
Here.
Here. Here.
Thank you. And report regarding posting of agenda?
The agenda for this meeting was posted on Wednesday, November 10th, 2010 on the bulletin board outside City Hall and on the city's website.
Thank you. Would everyone stand and please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Of course, we have no approval of minutes to approve. We have no speaker cards on, well, I take that back. We do have one speaker card on oral communications, and it would be Colin Bogart. So used not to having one. I just almost went by you, sir.
No problem. President Kane, Commission members, city staff.
Thanks for the promotion.
Good evening. My name is Colin Bogart, and I work for the Los Angeles County Bicycle Coalition, working with the City of Glendale on the Safe and Healthy Streets project. And I'm here just to make a quick announcement for you and for the viewers at home or online. And I do have a brief slide that I'd like to show you in conjunction with that announcement. As you may know, a major component of the Safe and Healthy Streets project is to draft a set of policy recommendations that seek to support and encourage bicycling and walking in the city of Glendale as part of the Place Grant project. And I'm here to tell you that the team of city staff members and I that I've been working with, folks in the planning department, public works engineering, traffic and transportation, the police department, and the community services and parks departments, we have completed an initial rough draft of the Safe and Healthy Streets plan. We've already done a couple of community meetings at the end of October to collect feedback on that draft plan. And I'm here tonight just to let you know and to let the viewers know that we are continuing to accept comments on this draft plan until November 30th of 2010. And I wanted to let people know that if they would like, they can download this draft document at la-bike.org/Glendale. And they can send the comments directly to me via email at colin@la-bike.org. If people have questions, they can certainly give me a call. My number is 818-334-9731. I do want to mention the document is quite large, and we have found that with our community feedback meetings that it was a bit of a overwhelming document for a lot of people. So we are telling people that if there's a particular section of the document that they feel particularly strongly about, it is divided into a number of sections, including education, enforcement, engineering, evaluation, encouragement. So if people want to pick a particular section and give us feedback on the section that they feel most passionate about, we would love that. And with that, I just want to thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Any questions for the speaker? Seeing none. Thank you, sir. We'll move on to new business. It's the Downtown Specific Plan Area in Glendale. The applicant is the City of Glendale. And this is a presentation on potential amendments to parking requirements for the Downtown Specific Plan Area in Glendale. It's a presentation of potential amendments to downtown parking standards to implement the parking management chapter of the mobility study and amending Chapter 30.32, parking and loading of the Glendale Municipal Code related to the parking standards within the Downtown Specific Plan Area. These amendments include lowering minimum parking requirements for commercial and residential uses, raising the parking exemption for businesses from 2,000 to 5,000 square feet, and opportunities to satisfy parking requirements through implementing transportation demand management, TDM, programs within the Downtown Specific Plan Area. The zone is the Downtown Specific Plan Area, also known as DSP, and staff is represented by Michael Nielsen, a mobility planner. And then with that, I guess I would ask staff to take over.
Okay.
Good evening, members of the Planning Commission and members of the Transportation and Parking Commission. My name is Mike Nilsson. I'm the Mobility Planner for the City of Glendale. And tonight we will be presenting potential amendments to the parking code in the downtown specific plan area. These potential amendments are part of implementing policies in the parking management chapter in the mobility study. This document and policies for discussion tonight complement the downtown specific plan, which was developed in tandem with the downtown mobility study. These two documents work together to achieve the vision for downtown, which is a vibrant, walkable, mixed-use urban center. These recommendations are a result of approximately 2 years of research with our consultant, Nelson Nygaard. We also conducted a variety of outreach meetings with various stakeholders in the downtown community, which include the Downtown Merchants Association, includes the Glendale Transportation Management Association, various real estate, property management, and local stakeholders in the community. We also looked at presenting at various study sessions to City Council, and also did a couple presentations on best practices in parking management policy to the Transportation and Parking Commission. From this outreach and research, we compiled a set of recommendations for your consideration and discussion tonight. We also informed our stakeholders of this meeting so we could get input and discussion from not just the commissions, but also from the downtown stakeholders. And we intend to involve the stakeholders throughout the process when we go to additional study sessions with council, and also when we do any code changes with the commission and council in future meetings. We tend to involve the stakeholders throughout the process. So while no formal direction is being taken tonight for these recommendations, we are looking for input and direction on 3 potential amendments to the parking code within the downtown specific plan area. And these include reducing the minimum parking requirements within the downtown specific plan area. Another one is raising the parking exemption from 2,000 to 5,000 square feet. Another one is incorporating opportunities to reduce required parking through transportation demand management programs, as well as an in lieu fee option. So those are 3 areas that we're looking for feedback and direction from the commissions and the public. In addition, any additional items of interest that are brought up that might not necessarily align with these 3 items will also be included in terms of we intend to go back to City Council for a study session for further discussion and input on these items. Also, we're looking to get any direction and actually getting whether or not to proceed with code changes. So that's our next step, and we intend to do that in early 2011. Once we get the green light to move forward on those code changes, we will be bringing these back to you, the Planning Commission and the Transportation Parking Commission, for your advisory recommendation before going to the City Council for adoption sometime in the middle of 2011. So with that, I introduce Bonnie Nelson from Nelson Nygaard. They've been our consultant working on these various recommendations. She'll do a PowerPoint presentation, and after the presentation is over, myself, Bonnie Nelson, and staff representatives from the Planning Department, Transportation Department, and as well as the Traffic and Transportation Department and Redevelopment are available to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Commissioners, thank you for having me this evening. Before I begin my remarks, I want to say that Mike sent me yesterday a clip from the newspaper that, and it always makes me nervous when my work is in the paper before I even come to present it. But invariably when that happens, the topic is parking, because it's a very emotional topic. And I want to, so before I begin my remarks, I just want to say that this is one step in a long process that began over 2 years ago when we completed the mobility plan and looked at parking needs in the DSP in the downtown area, which are quite different from parking needs in the neighborhoods. And I want to be clear that anything we discuss tonight is really focused on the downtown area, a place where you want to develop a lively, mixed-use entertainment district where you want people to shop and live and go out to dinner and work and that the needs of a multi-use downtown are quite different than the needs of residential neighborhoods. So I wanted to be clear that we are dealing only with downtown. I also want to be clear on why we're here in the first place. Why would you even look at parking codes, parking requirements? The answer is, in Glendale, in the downtown, your current parking code is quite honestly broken. It's broken for a couple of reasons. One is you have many historic buildings on brand in your main street of your downtown that were built with little or no parking. They're what's there. And they're historic buildings, they're historic uses, and you want vibrancy, you want those buildings to continue to be used, yet you have a parking code which makes it virtually impossible to use some of those buildings in the way that people would want to use them, with the kind of development that would want to be there. I will reiterate this again later. You couldn't build the Alex Theater today. It has no parking of its own. And yet, there's no one sitting here who would say that the Alex Theater is anything but a fantastic asset to downtown Glendale. So, in that respect, the parking code is broken. In another respect, it is broken, and that is that right now, for any reason or for no reason, a developer can come to the city and say, well, I know the parking code says I need to build 180 parking spaces or 170 parking spaces, whatever the number is. But I would propose that I build 130 parking spaces. And I propose that because if I have to go another level down in my parking garage or another level up in my parking garage, it will cost an enormous amount of money and I will not be able to build this development, which you want. And you are dealing as a planning commission with one-off questions of can we adjust the parking a little bit for this one and a little bit for that one, and it becomes a beauty contest on whether we like this development or not. But it also adds many months of time to the developer's application in this climate. And we've been talking for a couple of years, over a year now about in this climate. But even as we come out of the recession, banks want certainty. And as a developer is trying to put together their deal, and they have to go through a multi-month process to get the certainty that you'll allow them to build the amount of parking they think they can offer, they cannot get their financing until they get that answer. By streamlining the process and still ensuring that enough parking is available to meet the needs downtown, you will be able to encourage the kind of development that you want. So that's why I'm here, and let's talk a little bit about this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and goals of the project, remind you what we said in the DSP several years ago, and what our recommendations are for implementation. The DSP, I said two, it's really more than two, it was 2007, we're approaching the fourth year now, was designed to manage traffic congestion, encourage use of alternative modes, and create a multimodal and pedestrian-oriented downtown, a key component of which was parking. The major recommendation of the mobility study, or a major recommendation, was the installation of the pay station meters on Brand Boulevard. Those were implemented in 2008, and they had exactly the effect that we hoped they would have. They've increased the availability of parking, they've reduced cruising, they've added revenue to the city, and they've resulted in a coordinated management between the on-street parking on Brand and the parking in the parking garages. Even with that change, which resulted in increases in utilization of the garages, your city garages continue to be significantly underutilized. Even in the peak demand times, your city garages seldom have more than 60% of their capacity used. The goals of the DSP include managing your parking with a focus on maintaining availability, not simply increasing supply. Parking spaces are very expensive. A parking space in an asphalt lot costs about $25,000. A parking space in a parking building, depending on whether you build up or down, can cost as much as $80,000. So there really is such a thing as too much parking. You want to be sure that you manage it properly. And we want to improve the coordination of the on-street and off-street parking supply. We want to remove barriers to development and adaptive reuse so that you can have the lively downtown that you want and create regulatory certainty for developers. And we want to support the sustainability goals of reduced congestion, vehicle emissions, and safety by reducing traffic conflicts. So our recommendations are focused on the downtown specific plan area only. They're designed to be implemented as a package to the extent possible so that you don't get unintended consequences, and we can talk about those. We want the adjustments to be sensible and scaled to Glendale, and if you read the memo, you know that we tried not to pick places like San Francisco and Berkeley, which I'm very familiar with, but which are not in the same environment as Glendale, but tried to pick cities that are more of your peers. But that are really at the best practices in parking. We're not proposing a complete overhaul of your parking requirements, but targeted adjustments. We are still suggesting that you maintain parking minimums, which is not necessarily what will be built, but which is a minimum requirement. So a developer can always build more parking than what you are requiring. But they must build or satisfy your minimum requirements. We focus on land uses where the impact will be the greatest, and we are doing this to bring Glendale in line with its peer cities and best practice cities. There are 3 different kinds of recommendations. The first is changes in the proposed minimum requirements, and here we have kept our recommendations very we have not shaken things up dramatically. We have recommended a number of changes to the parking requirements in multifamily housing for 1-bedroom units down from 1 1/4 to 1, keeping the 2 bedrooms where we are. We're adjusting the guest parking a little bit. The peer cities that are at this level or lower include cities like Culver City, Long Beach, Pasadena, West Hollywood has a low retail requirement, Denver, Sacramento, Hercules, Ventura, San Diego, Long Beach. These are all cities that are at this level or lower than what we are recommending. And again, this is reductions in the minimums that really begin to reflect what is actually being built today, since your minimums are not actually being built. We are also recommending another category of changes that is significant, and that is the change of use. The current code requires that any change of use over 2,000 square feet be brought up to existing code requirements. What we find is that on Brand Boulevard, there are many buildings that are between 2,000 and 5,000 square feet that would be required to be brought up to code, but it is almost impossible to do so. So to reuse those buildings on Brand, to put in a restaurant or a coffee house or a bookstore, would require the developer to come in and ask for an exception. We find that under 5,000 square feet is a reasonable place to move the limit to allow for redevelopment of Brand in ways that meet with the goals of the DSP. Anything over 5,000 square feet is going to be a large restaurant and entertainment venue. Going to be a different kind of use, and we think that at that point it's important that parking be offered. The third kinds of recommendations we made is we have provided developers with a toolbox that will allow them to meet their requirements, but not always to build parking. And that sounds complicated, and let me try to explain it. These are not reductions to the minimums, but they are tools that the developer might be able to use in order to meet their requirements in other ways. Simple one, for example, would be to allow for tandem or stacked parking in certain situations. We would require that that if you are going to have a tandem or stacked parking in a residential property, that you only allow tandem if both units are being offered to the same dwelling unit. So that if you have a couple, they have 2 cars, they can do the shuffle among themselves, but that you wouldn't block in a neighbor. So you could have 100% of your parking tandem or stacked, but only if it was assigned to the same unit. Currently, you require that all parking be independently accessible and that you only allow tandem in excess of your minimum requirement. That really doesn't make sense in the current environment where parking is so expensive. So what we are suggesting is that we offer developers the opportunity to meet their requirements, but provide it in this new way. We are also recommending that shared parking be a right that developers can use. This works best, obviously, when you have different uses with different peak periods. In La Cañada Flintridge, where I was just doing a parking study last year, we found a bank, for example, that is closed on the weekends, that is next to a restaurant, that has spillover parking on the weekend. Perfect. Rather than encroaching on the neighborhood, we helped to broker a shared parking agreement so that patrons of the restaurant could park in the bank parking lot on evenings and weekends. That's the kind of thing that now can happen in Glendale, but requires approvals and permits and public hearings, and people often complain anything having to do with parking, after all, it got us in the newspaper yesterday, raises a lot of concerns, and there's no certainty that you can build that development. To make the process less onerous, we would allow shared parking within mixed-use buildings as of right. We would allow shared parking among different buildings and at off-site facilities, provided they're within a 1,000-foot walking distance, so as to be convenient, and allow shared parking to satisfy any amount of parking requirement, provided that they have different peak periods and can show that the parking will be available. We are also recommending the implementation of an in-lieu fee. What an in-lieu fee does is it allows a developer to pay money rather than build parking. They pay money into a parking fund that would then be used to build your next parking garage. When you find that your parking garages are filling up, and you're a long way from that, you would have the money available to bond back then and to build your parking garage, to build your next parking garage. This is an option. It would not be a requirement, and in fact, most developers would not take advantage of this option, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But for those developers where you've got that next floor of parking problem, the kinds of developers who are coming to you now and saying, I can build 90% of the parking, but I need you to let me out of that last 10%, because that would require another floor in my garage, and those are $80,000 a space, and it would make my design ugly and you wouldn't like it anyway. You're approving most of those requests right now, after a lot of rigmarole. You're approving them one after another after another. You're getting nothing for that right now, except the thank you from the developer. What an in-lieu fee would do is set up a system so that if that developer did not want to build that last floor of parking and because it would be so expensive, they could pay you money instead. It would meet their requirement. You would say, yes, you've met your parking requirement, but they would not have to come to you for a waiver. They would not have to come to you for permission. Now, we don't recommend that you be able to use this for all of your parking in a new development. We recommend a combination of fee types for new developments and change of use. If you're building a new development, we are going to ask you to pay a one-time fee of $24,000 per space for each space you don't build. Again, I said that going to the third level of an underground garage, a parking space could cost you $80,000. In some ways, this is a terrific bargain, you might think. Why not make it $80,000? Well, the reason is that the developer when the developer comes into you now for the exception, he's telling you that if you make me build that parking, my development's not viable and I will go away. $24,000 is about what peer cities are charging. I have a graph of that I'll show you in a moment. And we would allow these fees to adjust every year according to the Engineering Record Construction Index, so that as inflation goes up, so do the fees. For those developments that are reuses, we can't ask for a one-time fee. We would ask for an annual fee of $600 per year per space, and that these fees would have to be included in any tenant leases to ensure that if that developer goes away, we continue to receive our annual fee. In new developments, you could use the in-lieu fee up to 50% of your parking requirement. In change of use, you could use it for the entire amount. The fee would go with the land, not with the property owner. This chart shows you what other cities are charging for their in-lieu fee. It also gives you an idea of the range of cities that have in-lieu fees. And you'll recognize many of the names there, some larger than you, some smaller than you. At $24,000, you would be just beyond the mean, just higher than the mean. There's a fourth kind of recommendation that we made in our report, and that is to provide a toolbox for developers to actually further reduce their requirement. The in lieu fee allows you to meet your requirement, but we're offering them ways to reduce their requirement, not by coming and asking for permission, not by going through the current process, but by doing things of value to the city. None of these would be required, and developers would use them only when they felt they needed to. I mentioned on the in lieu fee that developers wouldn't use them as much as you think. What we find in all those cities that were on that graph that have in lieu fees is about 1/10 of their developments actually use them. The reason is a developer is deciding between writing you a check, and it's a pretty big check, or putting in more parking in their development, and if they think that having more parking makes their development more viable, makes them able to sell those condo units, makes them able to get those office tenants, they'll build the parking. They will only give you the in lieu fee when they feel that they have adequately met their parking demand. And developers are pretty smart in this regard, and they know what they need to sell their product. So they're not going to underpark, but they're going to pay you that little bit of extra in order to keep their development viable. We're looking at a couple of ways to reduce parking demand. One is proximity to transit. I did a study in downtown LA, and what we found there was that developments that were within a quarter of a mile of a major transit facility, which in downtown LA included a rail station or a bus route that operated at 10 minutes or better, that those developments had a 25% reduction in parking demand because people could take transit to them. In Glendale, we are not going that far. We are not recommending going that far. We are recommending that if you're within 1/8 of a mile of a major transit facility, which we are defining as a bus stop that serves both local and regional buses, and that has at least a 15-minute frequency, you could get a 10% parking reduction. If you're within a quarter mile of one of these facilities, you could have a 5% parking reduction. In Glendale, that would include Brand Boulevard, Central Avenue, Broadway, and Colorado. Those would be the only streets on which this would apply. We are also recommending that transportation demand management, which has been proven to be very successful in reducing drive-alone trips and therefore the need for parking, could be implemented in developments, but we're not just going to let a developer say, oh yeah, I'll implement TDM. Currently, all that your TDM ordinance requires a developer to do is put up a bulletin board, basically. They put up a bulletin board and say, here's the bus routes that are near here. That's all they have to do. That is not a TDM program. What we're saying is if you have a real, measurable, and we will measure you, TDM program that proves that you have reduced the demand for parking, then we will allow you to reduce your parking requirement. And these TDM programs typically fall into one of 6 categories. They include pricing, parking cash out, where you charge everyone for parking. You may use that money to subsidize your transit service. You may run a shuttle. There's a whole range of things that could be offered. Your current TDM ordinance only applies to non-residential development, and as I said, is extremely limited. So what we are proposing here is that developers can have a parking reduction that is based on the breadth and depth of their TDM program. If you read the memo, you notice we've developed a point system, and in order to receive your parking reduction, which would be between 10 and 30%, you would have to have a multi-pronged approach to TDM. I can answer questions about that if you have any. You would have to report annually, and you would have to be a member of the TMA, and you would have to require that all of your tenants in your building also implemented this TDM program. It would have to be a requirement of the lease. The 3 tiers, as I mentioned, would depend on the significance of your TDM program. In order to get the maximum, the 30% reduction, you would have to have a very robust TDM program, and you would have to include at least one parking or financial incentive. So you would have to have parking cash out, you would have to charge for parking, you would have to do something that would discourage the use of cars as well as encouraging other options. For example, to get to the 30-point reduction in this example, if you had a development that that had parking pricing for commuters, that provided free transit passes for everyone who worked in the building, that had a shuttle service from the closest transit stop, and that provided access or reduced fees for a car sharing facility in the building, that would meet the point requirement to get a 30% reduction. But it would be a very high bar to cross. We recommend requiring TMA membership so that the new development of a certain size would become dues-paying members of the Transportation Management Association. I noticed that Brooke is here, and I'm so pleased to see her. One of the issues that the TMA has had to struggle with over the years is that there are a few very large employers that are members of the TMA. They're extremely disparate. They're all over the city. They include Disney, they include the hospital, but they don't include some real obvious ones like the Americana and their tenants. So getting new development to be a member of the TMA, anything you can do to incentivize them and let Brooke get her hands on them is going to be a good thing. And we're recommending that any commercial development over 30,000 square feet and any residential development over 8 units in the downtown area be required to join. I think I said there were 5 categories, but I got 6. No, I think I got 7. But these are quick. The next one is to adopt a bicycle parking ordinance. You don't have one right now. Many cities do. Pasadena, Oakland, Portland, Sacramento. You have fabulous weather in this town. You are building bicycle facilities. You've got Colin. Is Colin still here? Colin is still here. Working on healthy streets and encouraging biking and walking. But your bicycle parking at the end of your trip is appalling. What we are recommending is that you adopt a comprehensive bicycle parking ordinance that would apply to all land uses downtown, similar to your standard parking ordinances, but also allow for bicycle parking, additional bicycle parking, to substitute for up to 10% of your required parking. So you could turn car parking stalls into bicycle parking cages if you had the demand for that. We are recommending that you allow these reductions as of right. Again, the whole idea here is to reduce the administrative burden, to avoid the current process where you give these things away for free again and again, and it undermines the effectiveness of your larger plans and policies and strategies downtown. And this will not eliminate, but it will greatly reduce the need for the discretionary process. A developer will still have the option of coming to you, but you will have the ability to say, hey, wait a minute, you want to have your parking reduced by 30 spaces? Pay the in-lieu fee. Why are you here? Let's see a TDM program. Why are you here? Currently, you don't have that stick. This is a graph that I don't expect you to read from where you are, but it shows the multi-step process that involves at least 2 city agencies and the council as a developer negotiates for what their actual number of parking spaces could be. As I mentioned, this is a significant administrative burden, and the process can take up to 6 months, during which time it is almost impossible for a developer to secure financing. What we are proposing for developments larger than 5,000 square feet is a 4-step process that should take no more than 6 to 8 weeks, that would reduce the administrative burden and would get the city something for what it is now giving away. For developments under 5,000 square feet, it would be an extremely quick process. It would take about a week. It would have very limited administrative burden, and the result would likely be no different than the result would be under the current system. This I just want to do one illustration of how these proposed recommendations would work. Considering a multifamily residential project in the downtown area, 51-bedroom units, 52-bedroom units, that's located very close to a major transit hub. Under your existing requirements, You would have to build parking for the 1 and 2 bedroom units and guest parking, and that total would be 187 and a half spaces. I suppose that means you'd have to build 188 because I don't know what you would do with half a parking space. Under the proposals that we have, the requirement goes down a little bit from 187 and a half to 150 parking spaces, with the possibility of some additional reductions because of the proximity to transit, because of a major TDM program, because of an exceptional bicycle parking program. You couldn't eliminate parking for this development, but you could get it down substantially only with significant work on the part of the developer. Now, there's nothing in this example that would prohibit the developer from building 200 parking spaces if that's what he thought was necessary to sell his product. I want to look at a real-world example. We looked at a couple, of course, because they've all come to you for exceptions. They're all complicated. In this example, at 300 North Central, the residential live, work, and restaurant project came to you. They were required to build 172 parking spaces. They asked to build 165. Under our recommendation, the requirement would be to build 138. Developer could still build 165, but they could build as few as 138 without coming to you for an exception. So that is how this works and what we are recommending. I know it's complex. We're at an important step in the process, and I look forward to your questions and receiving your direction. Thank you.
All right. Well, before we have commissioners start weighing in, is there anything else that staff wants to add to this presentation?
We're good.
Okay. All right. I'm sure we all have a lot of comments and stuff. Is there anyone that would like to start off? Please.
What is the TMA? What does it do?
What does it do? Well, you have the TMA director here. It's a Transportation Management Association, and what it does is work with developers and employers to develop programs that will reduce drive alone to work, basically. And so there are programs like ride sharing, ride matching, there's van pooling, there's transit information, encouraging safe routes for biking and walking, and a whole host of programs that are designed to help the employer to reduce drive alone and therefore parking demand.
Is it region-wide or just Glendale? Or
The TMA, they really came out of the Air District regulations in the 90s. They are generally individual city by city. You have one in Glendale, and your executive director is here. One of the most successful ones that's always talked about is Burbank, actually, which has an extremely successful program. And success depends on membership. It's a membership organization funded in large part by dues.
Thanks.
Please. On the second to the last slide that you had up there, if you can pull that up, that one right there. I have a question about this. So you get down to 75 requirement for the spaces. It's 100 units in the building. Earlier in the presentation, you said that you couldn't split tandem. So how do you get to 75 spaces, which are for the whole building when there's 100 units?
Well, what this says is the requirement just on the face of it is 150 in this example. The way we got down to 75 is we said, okay, well, if this building was located really close to transit, we'll knock 10% off of that. And if they put together this fabulous TDM program, they're going to charge for parking, they're going to give free transit passes to everybody, and they're going to have bike parking, and they're going to have, ride matching, whatever they're going to have, they could actually knock off 45 more spaces. They could get 30% off. And then if they're going to have a fabulous bicycle parking program, they could knock another 10% off. So that is without the use of tandem parking, that they could get down to 75 under this example.
But they can use up to 100% of tandem to meet the requirements.
Yes.
So how does that work in this situation?
Well, they could use up to 100% to meet the 150. They could have 75 tandem spaces for, 150 parked cars in 75 tandem spaces if they wanted to do that. Although not, I shouldn't say that. In the one-bedroom units, they would not be able to do that. So the question is, tandem is applied then onto what you're going to provide. So for those two-bedroom units, where we're saying that you have to provide 2 spaces per unit, You could get that down to one space if it was a tandem space. We did not apply tandem to this example.
Okay, but from, if I read that correctly, you're saying it can get down to 75, and all 75 can be used as tandem.
That's misleading in this example.
Okay.
Only the two-bedroom units where you have 2 spaces per unit could you do tandem, because there is the requirement that you can only do tandem when there are 2 in the same unit.
So, for all intents and purposes, in this particular example, you would still have to have at least 100 parking spaces, because each unit would still have to have at least 1 parking space.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
Who would like to go next? Ms. Landrigan?
Well, in the same example,
Swivel, just-
even though you have these incentives and you are cutting down on the upfront administrative cost, you have subsequent administrative costs because you have to monitor the program and make sure that it's being conducted in compliance. And what are the consequences of not being in compliance? Secondly, because you can have these, reduction tool kits. How do you make sure that? I mean, right now we don't really have transit centers. We do have bus routes, but we're not like Pasadena. We're not like Long Beach. We don't have any light rail or rapid transit. So we really, and how are you going to guarantee that the individuals who are living in this or working in this area are using it? It may not be convenient. At the moment, if we went with this toolkit and it dealt with an eighth of a mile, and I know you changed the radius to compensate for the lack of more varieties of transportation. How would you, though, guarantee that this was going to be happening? I mean, you could still, you might still have a family that has 3 cars.
Absolutely. There's
so
never.
what will happen to those cars in that circumstance?
It's a really good question. There's never a guarantee, is part of the answer. All we know is from empirical research, every place we work, if you are close to good quality transit, the number of car trips goes down. That's true if you're in Chicago, it's true if you're in Portland, it's true if you're in Los Angeles. And I don't mean the cities, I mean the metro areas. That's been proven again and again and again. There's no reason why that would be different in Glendale. Now, is it possible that there would be a family living in a building right on top of a great transit stop in Glendale with 4 people and 4 cars and none of them use transit? Of course it's possible. But their next door neighbor might have 4 people, no cars, and no trips. We know that in the aggregate, this works. We don't know in any one particular person's situation. So what happens? The family with 4 cars, where none of them can use transit, probably isn't moving into that building. Because there's not going to be enough parking available for them, or parking will be priced, and they're going to have to pay extra to move into that building. But someone else who's able, because they now live downtown, to bike to work, they're going to be happy as a clam to move into that building. So those are the trade-offs. And it always comes down to that. Like, people want to think about someone they know or themselves, right? Would I move into a building like that? Well, in my family, we have 3 drivers, 1 car, and none of us drive to work. So the car sits all week. And if we had a car share car in the building, we'd get rid of the car we have. So for us, it works. For you, it might not. It's just a different product type that works in the aggregate.
Well, and if I just can, and I appreciate what you're saying, I think that's valid, but just because you've reduced car trips doesn't mean you reduce the need to have a car.
That's
cars.
right.
And that's the concern I have about.
And for that, in large part, we rely on developers who will not build buildings where they cannot sell their product. And so people will know, experienced developers in Glendale will know that this is what I need to sell my product. Now, you asked about the monitoring and what happens if you're out of compliance, and that's a very good question. And in the places where we do annual monitoring, where we've given reductions for TDM, we need to make sure that they're still in the program, that their program works. So if your program is not working, the city would have the option of requiring you to add things to your program. So we might say, your program isn't working because you said you were going to give transit passes, but you aren't giving transit passes to everyone. So we're enforce it. We're going to force you to do it, and we want proof that you've done it. And we're going to go through the TMA and they're going to manage this for you, and they're going to make sure you do this. If they've done everything you asked them to do and it still doesn't work, you could require them to buy monthly parking in your city garage to add to their space. You could require them to develop a shared parking arrangement. Obviously, you can't require them to add a floor to their parking garage. And I know that that's the fear, right, is that what if we let them do this and it doesn't work, then we've given up the opportunity. But we know that there is ample parking downtown, and you have a lot of flexibility to do a shared parking arrangement if you have to go that way.
May I ask one more question?
Sure.
In reading through the very comprehensive report, at the end I noticed that the in-lieu fee programs in two of the cities you used as comparable cities have been suspended due to the fact that those in-lieu fees were not covering the cost of what they were doing. And you said, why not charge $80,000 instead of $25,000? And I also saw that Powell is very considerably smaller than we are, and probably far more restrictive than we are, has a very high fee. But at the same time, you didn't really delve into those two reasons as why they had suspended their in lieu fees, and those seem to me to be indicators that we might want to have a little more information on, so that we can understand.
There is a separate report on the in-lieu parking with a lot more detail in it. The two that have suspended their program, I'm very familiar with one, not so much with the other, but with the one example I'm familiar with, it was a fee that did not go up with inflation. And so it had been implemented 15 years ago, and costs have gone up so much, but the fee did not keep pace with it. And one of the lessons learned from that is that when you put in your fee, you put in your cost builder at the same time, because construction costs only go in one direction, really.
Sure. Please.
Would you consider using city lots for shared parking for residential developments?
City garages or city surface
City
lots?
structures.
City structures, yes, I think that that's not an unreasonable thing to do. The high demand for residential parking is overnight, and the high demand for city garages is more in the daytime and dinner hour, and there is excess capacity available.
So it would work.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as far as trip generation versus parking demand, do you see a direct link
Yes.
between the two? And can you elaborate?
Yes. It ties to the question that Commissioner Landegren asked. When you're asking about, when you're saying, well, we understand that you'll reduce the number of trips, but will it actually reduce the number of cars? What we find is that the number of trips reduce quickly, the number of cars reduce more slowly, but they are in fact linked as people discover that when a car is sitting all day, that is an expensive paperweight, and it has to be insured, and it has to be kept up, and people will ultimately reduce the number of cars that they have. Particularly if you have a residential building that has a car share pod in the building. And for those of you who are not familiar with car share, it's essentially an hourly car rental where you're a member and you sign up online. You need a car so that in my family, as I mentioned, we have one car. And in the rare event on a Saturday when I need to do something and my husband needs to do something different, I can get a car share car. We can do our separate things. It costs me about $8 an hour to have a car share car, and they are always
insurance.
It includes insurance
gas.
and gas and tolls.
Right.
And
yeah.
it's
quite a great deal.
It's quite a great deal, and they're always new. They're always brand new cars, and I don't have to worry about
the
that.
closest one to us is in Pasadena.
Right. So when you're starting to look at some higher density residential downtown, a requirement that they have a car share pod would be a very helpful thing, not just for the people who live in the building, but for other people who are downtown. So that, yes, you will eventually reduce the number of cars.
Please.
I want to go back to Commissioner Landrigan's comment about enforcement. You talked about you'd have to go and force them to do more TMA and stuff like that, but what happens if they say no? What are the tools to actually force it? What do we have as our big stick to say, if you don't do it, something will happen to you? What is that something?
Well, I would actually turn to the city staff on that, but it can be part of their permit to occupy. It can be part of the requirements. There are steps in the process where developers have to get permits from the city, and these things can be legally part of the permit process. It's done differently in different places, and I don't know if Glendale has thought through where they might most likely handle that.
I don't know that we have, but since Bonnie earlier mentioned that Burbank has an effective program, I think part of the reason that they do is because it's mandatory. It's in their code that they do it. And when I was in their city attorney's office, I often made calls to the employers who were required to do it and made them submit their paperwork. So there are tools available to enforce that.
Okay.
I have a question. Actually, and a concern. I think one of the issues that concerns me is the overflow. I suspect might be an overflow of vehicles. If say a building is going with these, let's say this example where they have reduced their number of parking spaces. My concern is with the neighboring areas and the residential areas, and the overflow, which I would suspect would happen. In a perfect world, I can understand what you're saying, and then I think that sounds good. But what I do think would happen is the overflow into the neighborhood, the residential areas where they're already jam-packed, and it's a powder keg in many situations downtown. So what do you know in your experience in looking at these cities, these peer cities, what has been, if that's ever been examined, what is the impact?
That's a really good question. And, we dealt with this in a couple of ways in Glendale already. When we recommended the meters on brand, one of the most common concerns that people came to the council with was that there would be overflow parking in the neighborhoods. If you're not going to allow people to park for free on brand, they'll simply come park for free on the neighborhood streets. And we can ask staff whether there's been a huge increase in complaints, but I certainly have not heard that. So we've been able to implement paid parking on brand without the negative impacts that people were concerned about. It does happen. The other place we've been looking at it in Glendale, quite honestly, is South Brand, where it's not a parking pricing problem. It's a large number of employees who are going to work at the auto dealers where there may not be parking available for them, parking in the residential neighborhoods in South Brand. In that case, we are recommending a neighborhood parking district that will protect the neighborhoods. And we would recommend something similar in the neighborhoods surrounding downtown if there is a spillover issue. You can do permitted parking in the neighborhoods that will protect the streets for the neighbors. My understanding is there was a problem to some extent around Nestle that was doing a paid parking situation, and employees were parking in the neighborhood. And so I think you have to look at that very carefully, and you have to be ready to do a permit parking program for the residential neighborhoods to make sure that they are not unduly impacted by employees.
One follow-up question. If I'm correct, your recommendation for guest parking, the ratio was 1 to 10. What was that based on?
It's based on best practices, what other cities are using now, and what we find is that if you have guest parking and there is the opportunity for guests to either park on the street, park nearby, or share spaces with tenants where you don't have an assigned space, you allow guest parking. 1 to 10 is an appropriate ratio. When we laugh that it's an appropriate ratio until your neighbor has a party, right? But even whatever the current ratio is not enough when your neighbor has a party. So 1 to 10 seems to be an appropriate ratio for a residential building when there is street parking or other parking available nearby.
Touching up on the spillover comment made by Commissioner Yakopian, The PPD memo was really interesting and had a lot of interesting recommendations. And it seems to me, it's a good idea to have the South Brand district, and obviously it will probably affect more than just South Brand and the other districts as well. And going forward with this downtown recommendations, it seems like the PPD recommendations you have in there would be a good idea to have a comprehensive parking recommendations with those included. Is that how you're intending to move forward, or the city is intending to move forward?
I think that
with more of a comprehensive look and not just one district.
Right. We did South Brand separately because there was a particular urgency about South Brand. If you implement a whole package of parking management changes downtown, you either would want to do a neighborhood parking district immediately, or you would want to be ready to do it if the problem arises in the neighborhood. We might have thought that there would be a problem when we began charging for parking on Brand. We're not seeing complaints. I'm not going to say that there isn't a problem because I haven't gone out and looked at it, but we're certainly not hearing complaints in the way that people were predicting we would. So you either have to do neighborhood parking district immediately in conjunction, or you have to be ready to go if there's a problem.
Yeah, what I'm more concerned about is not really the services we have right now, but once we have these new requirements in, the spillover effects that come from those things, like what was talked about earlier.
Right.
That might intensify more than what we were thinking about from what's already happened right now.
Right. And I think, having the parking district in place, ready to go, with changing the way you vote for them so that you opt out rather than in. I won't go back over that whole presentation, but those kinds of things to ensure the neighborhoods that you're not going to leave them hanging would be very helpful as we go forward.
Ms. Landrigan.
I think Commissioner Yacobian had a really good issue, and furthermore, I think what is the question is that now neighborhoods that have parking by right are going to lose that right, except for they're going to have to pay for it at the expense of everyone else being able to buy out of it. That seems a very unfair trade-off to me, for our citizens to have to pay for our developers to have better parking so they have a different situation. So is the fund that is going to be set aside as part of the in lieu fee or buying your way out of having adequate parking going to be available to subsidize our residents who are living in a situation right now already have impacted parking? Because if it isn't, I think that's something that should be considered, and that's an issue because these are some of our multi-family units. They're already impacted economically just as our developers are, and yet they don't have the banks giving them loans at the moment. So I think there's a concern here with a little more equity. I don't see that equity being addressed in the adjacent land use zones.
Well, the fees that would be paid for in lieu fee would go to the parking fund and would be available for building new parking when that becomes necessary, and could also be used, if you broaden the definition of what the parking fund can be used for other ways to reduce parking demand. But with the idea that a saved, the way we do in energy when we look at a negawatt, right, that an energy saved is the same as energy provided. Well, it's kind of the same thing in parking. But that aside, the money goes into the parking fund, is used for parking-related programs. So yes, the funds would be available.
Could it be used within a certain radius if it has an impact on that radius?
Sure.
That's one of the issues that happens too often. We have people put in lieu funds into something and it doesn't address the area it impacts. So to me, I would think that even a developer would want to have a neighborhood consistency and a feel-good issue so that if they have to pay into it, they mitigate the neighbors in neighborhood that they're impacting as opposed to some other neighborhood. And especially in these areas, I really do have a deep concern about impacting some of the neighborhoods that are very much adjacent to this area because they are, it is a large walking community, but the people who do have cars are already impacted there. That's a concern I have.
That's a good concern.
I'm sorry, Bill, did you want to go ahead?
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, how can we not have heard from you?
The biggest mouth in town. I'm always a little bit suspicious when I see kind of what look like magic numbers and things. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the background for the existing standards and parking minimums that are enshrined in the Glendale Municipal Code. Maybe not so much for me, but others who are listening. Where did those numbers come from, and what were they based on? And sort of a follow-up question for your best practice cities. What were the criteria for declaring a city a best practice city?
Good questions. I'm going to ask Jono to elaborate on where the Glendale Code comes from now, or Hassan. But what I will say is that the Glendale Code was, when it was developed, was consistent with the best practices of its time, which were, we are going to be an auto-oriented city, we are going to have plenty of parking, and there's no such thing as too much. Build, build, build. It was the same era in which we decided to just add lanes when we had congestion. We have now reached the point where we don't have the room to add the lanes nor the ability to add the parking spaces. That is why we look to best practice cities. And what they've done in the best practice cities, and I'm sorry that I don't have these graphs, very interesting things. They've actually gone and looked at their downtowns and said, we have this many square feet of retail, we have this many square feet of office, we have this many square feet of residential, and we have this many parking spaces, and here's our occupancy. And you know what? We don't need four spaces for 1,000 square feet of retail. We need 2 spaces for 1,000 square feet of retail. We live differently, we work differently, we travel differently than we did in 1956. And so that is how those, and the numbers, no matter where you go, no matter where you are in the country, are amazingly consistent from one city to the next. And Hassan, do you want to add where those numbers came from?
I'll let John start and I'll add something.
I think just very similar to what Bonnie said. It's over time, when land was available, there was a lot of demand for new buildings, so we just the parking ratios was developed at that time. There are many buildings in the city of Glendale that you look at the high-rise buildings. 655 North Central is a good example. If you go to the parking structure that was built, the top 2 levels most of the time are empty. The Nestle building has, based on those ratios that at the time was a requirement, that was the requirement, the Nestle building is similarly the same. We have 2 levels of parking that it doesn't need, and you can use it for others. Our parking structures, when we looked at building the new parking structure, like the marketplace parking structure, approximately 1,200 parking spaces, we looked at whatever land uses we're going to develop next door, and we did an estimating. To be honest with you, we were estimating a structure with 1,800 spaces. We start scaling it back and did shared parking analysis and looked at some of these ratios and comparable cities, and then we reduced. We ended up about 1,180 parking spaces. We'll still have, given that there is a recession, there is not a huge demand, we still are about 50% occupancy. And during different times of the day, you can still fill that parking structure with additional development that can occur in that area. But, we built Americana to the max with the number of spaces based on the retail ratios that we have. But Americana parking structure, even at the busiest time, still has availability. So those ratios kind of over time just grew. But we're looking back and saying, okay, if you built a Nestle building today, would you use the same ratios? You could still park it at less number of spaces.
Yeah, but part of what is happening at the Nestle building is they have that program where they pay their employees X number of dollars a month not to park in their parking structure.
That's right.
And I know this for a fact because my son is a Nestle employee. And he takes that money and he parks 2 or 3 blocks away and walks into the office. Now, if you do neighborhood parking, he's just not going to take the money anymore and he'll go back into the parking structure because he doesn't have a good alternative.
Right.
Then the mass transit alternative in Glendale is non-existent. So, you can say that you wouldn't do the same thing with Nestle, I don't know that that's true.
Well, we did, just in terms of mitigation, we did put in preferential parking in there, and that, yes, some of the people went back into the building, the others still either with their telecommuting, or, I mean, it's different from one structure to another. But overall, if you look at the office buildings in the city of Glendale, 450 North Brand, go to the parking structure, and you will see that at the peak time, 11 a.m. in the morning, that parking structure is not full, although the building is full. Whatever ways that people are parking, the on-street parking in those areas are not a problem. In other words, there is a mix of residential on-street parking and commercial, but we're not getting permit parking requests in that part of the city. We do get it south of Colorado, but north of Colorado doesn't exist. So there's going to have to be a balance, no question about it.
The only thing that I can add is some sort of a big picture and somewhat folksy approach to this that will summarize my shock when I came here in Glendale. Of course, I have to tell you that when I came with a little bit of a bias. I got out of planning school at a time that the ideas that Bonnie is talking about and is presenting tonight had been taught to us in planning school. I was a student of Don Shoup's that I know made a presentation to the Transportation Parking Commission. So I came out as this young Turk coming out of planning school thinking that these 1950s approaches to designing cities for cars rather than people is the wrong thing that has not worked, and we need to now start thinking about designing our cities for people as opposed to for cars. And I think having gone through my career and coming to Glendale, when I arrived in here and we wanted to look at downtown standards, Emil might remember this, my first meeting with the redevelopment staff was, okay, what are the standards that we use? They said, if you can park it, you can build it. That, to me, completely underlined the approach that Glendale had to city planning, especially in the downtown, that you really build for the cars. And if you can build the parking, then you can have the building. And there was no discussion of, well, who are the human beings that are being serviced by this downtown. And since then, we have spent a good 7 years in the city and have engaged in the conversation. I think we are in that painful between and betwixt moment that, yes, we do not have the complete transportation system that will support the people who will want to give up the cars. But this is where we're at, and we have to look at somewhere to start and to fund the transit system that I know John and his staff are desperately trying to do, and to complete the transit network that we need to have. And then we need to do several things at the same time. That's why when Bonnie mentions that this is a whole packet that needs to work at the same time, that you do need to do the preferential parking approach differently than we have done in the past, and you do need to require the transit cards to be offered when you actually at the same time you lower the parking standards. I think there is a level of risk in it, but it's not a completely uneducated risk. So that's kind of, so where did they come from? Conventions. That's where they came from. That's what I would say.
Please.
Okay, I'm going to ask a pretty unfair question for
Sure.
you. So given that there is this extra capacity, and given that we're in this betwixt place, a part of what is required here is to increase the density of the people who live in this downtown core. But as we transition to that, and try to build this additional capacity and allow parking reductions for them, to utilize some of the excess capacity, it's still going to have significant impacts in car trips and the trips that are going to be creating, because more cars are still going to be squeezing into this same space. So how is that going to impact from a transportation perspective?
Yes and no. The best way to reduce VMT, vehicle miles traveled, the best way to reduce VMT is to increase density. The more people and the more uses you have that are packed tighter together, the less miles your car travels. The less times your car travels. Eventually, the less cars you need. I'll give you an example. My definition of a walkable neighborhood is, can I get a quart of milk without getting into a motorized vehicle? You would be shocked how many developments call themselves transit-oriented development, but you have to get into your car to get a quart of milk. That infrastructure exists here right now. I can go to the Whole Foods. I can go to the Albertsons. I can go to the Trader Joe's. That is an unbelievable resource in a downtown for trying to add residents. You've got the video store. You've got the grocery store. You've got the dry cleaners. You've got all that you need, and you can walk to all of it right now. We talk a lot about transit and the need to get more people on transit, and it's all true. But in these places where we've densified and we see what the impact of density is on auto trips, the big winner is never transit. The big winner is walk. Because when you have your healthy streets, when you have when it's pleasant to walk and there are places to go to, the car stays in the garage and people walk. And that's true in places with some pretty rugged weather. I'm always shocked to say this, but it's true. The top 2 biking cities for bike commuting in North America are Portland, Oregon, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. Unbelievable. I don't figure it out. I did a big project in Minneapolis, and I met a man with studded snow tires on his bike.
I know. Hard to believe.
Hard to believe, but true. So if people can do it in those climates, people can do it here. You just have to have more people, more stuff.
But I just the people in West LA, I don't think would agree with you. In Santa Monica, in terms of traffic, they got density, and they're in this betwixt area, and it's a nightmare over there.
And they have some of the lowest parking requirements in the country because they've decided that congestion is okay in order to have life, in order to have vitality. Congestion's okay. That's a local decision. You may not want to go all the way to West Hollywood.
No, West LA.
Or West LA, I'm sorry.
Santa Monica.
Yeah.
I don't think the people who work and live there would agree it's hunky-dory.
But the question is, how much would that density have to increase here in the downtown core to get to that place?
It doesn't have to increase a huge amount, but you've got to get people living here. Right now you've got a daytime population downtown that is much higher than the overnighting population. It's true that there are some high-density neighborhoods around downtown, but your overnighting population is much smaller than your daytime. When that ratio is a little bit less different, you'll see a substantial difference.
What are those numbers?
What are the numbers of daytime
versus nighttime?
I don't know those numbers. Do you know those numbers, Jana or Hassan?
You don't know them, or you just don't recall them?
I don't recall them.
Okay.
Based on our traffic modeling, is about 275,000 total.
Total downtown.
Yeah, I mean this is our entire city.
Yeah.
I can't really window out. We have some numbers for the downtown.
Yeah.
But total, which I would say most concentration, you would say it would be in the downtown area.
But we don't know what the residential density is downtown compared to the daytime. We're talking about
the delta?
Yeah, the difference.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I
talking about
mobility
transition.
plan.
We have some numbers in our traffic model, but I don't have that number.
Yeah.
I'm hazarding the guess you're talking 20, 30,000 units additionally needed to talk the kind of transition that you're talking.
I don't think you would need that
Well,
much.
but
I think
my point
you-
is, I'm throwing out a number. There are no numbers. Where's the data? Where's the empirical information to tell us where are we, where do we need to go?
Well, that information is available through the traffic model, but what we know is that there is ample excess parking capacity available. That we know, and we know that because we counted cars. So we've actually counted, we know. We know what the capacity is of your downtown garages, and we know what the occupancy is in those garages.
Well, okay, now let's talk about that. So you're talking about there's empty spots in our garages. What's the percentage of unoccupied office space or unoccupied retail space? I mean, you can say a garage is empty. That's because the Kmart next door is no longer in business. So what's you have to look at the occupancy rate versus the empty parking rates
Correct.
to really know if it's true.
You're right. We took those counts in 2007 in conjunction with the mobility study, with the downtown mobility plan. Prior to the recession, peak time for business. Could there have been some empty offices? Of course there could have. Does it account for parking garages that never covered 50% of their occupancy? No. You haven't. You are oversupplied. I can say that as a fact.
I'm just pointing out, and it depends on the garage. If you're taking a poorly located garage compared to one that's in a let's say a really thriving retail area, you're going to have a packed garage. You're going to have an empty garage. You combine the two, it's skewing your data again.
Mm-hmm.
We looked at
it's
I can say that we have 100%, vacancy rate in a parking garage if it's, again, next to an out-of-business Kmart.
And all I would do is refer you to the mobility study, which has each garage, not totals, each garage, each parking lot in the public parking
And that
system.
data was from 2007?
From 2007, and each block face on the street parking, we counted and did occupancy, and that's in the report, exact numbers and percentages. So you should have all the data you need.
I think 2007, though, we still had a pretty high office vacancy rate.
Much lower than you have, I think lower than you have today, because it's pre-recession.
If I may, I think I don't know if Emil remembers the vacancy rate, the office vacancy rate during the boom. It was 16% at the highest. When it was the highest vacancy rate, it was about 16%, and I think that coincided with when Bonnie is referring to in terms of the data gathering. So that was the height of the market, and that was when we had about 16% vacancy, which was high, by the way, compared to our adjacent communities. But I would like to, if I may, introduce this whole other angle. But the way that the chair of the Planning Commission was going with his questioning, yes, if we go with the idea that if you're going to count the number of parking spaces that are available, you need to also take the number of spaces that are not being occupied that would otherwise be occupied. That takes us back to the paradigm that you need to have a parking space for every single person that's there. However, what we're introducing through the downtown mobility plan and the downtown specific plan is that is the paradigm that has given us the urban form that we want. If we want to get to the urban form that you're not necessarily wanting to have a parking space for every use that you're going to have in downtown, that we'd rather have you park somewhere and walk around and do some of your different uses through your hopping from one place to another. Number one. The other one is that if we might even want to see if we can deal with a little bit of friction between the different uses that exist and not having parking. The question, we can never answer what is the right number and what it'll take us to get there, because the answer to that question would be how much friction between the different users can you stand? Do you want to be as intense as Greenwich Village in New York or not? And I suspect nobody in Southern California wants to be Greenwich Village, New York, but there is different scales of friction that people are willing to put up with in order to get that exciting mix of activities. And I don't think we have even started to address that.
Well, there's a reason New Yorkers became New Yorkers, and it's the closeness that they live in. So.
I'm not at all advocating becoming like New York, by the way.
Other questions?
I have one last, just concern that I just want to get on the record for the in lieu fees. I like the idea of in lieu fees, and I think that's something that Glendale should possibly do with these developers. My big concern is that, and I know you were touching about it, you were saying that they may not actually go for that option. But my concern is that these fees shouldn't be much less than what the actual price is for the city to, say, put up a parking space. That I do not want there to be any so-called subsidy, like an indirect subsidy of these developers who are not putting in those parking spaces. And I know you would disagree, but I don't want there to be an unfair windfall to these developers, not putting in those parking. I think that the money accumulated from that should go back into public transportation, or a good portion of it should go back, so that it's helping to make that a viable situation for those developers, and kind of put it back into the system. I agree. But that's my thought on that.
I'd like to build directly on that. You threw out some numbers earlier about at-grade parking at around $24,000, underground as much as $80,000. Is that construction costs? Are you factoring in land? Where are you coming up with that number?
That is the cost of land and parking, land in the construction of the space. So when you're in a multi-level garage,
not factoring in land. Okay, I'm a construction professional. And on construction costs, those numbers are 100% higher. They're twice what the real costs are. You know, your parking spaces, construction cost-wise, are going to be around 12, and they're going to be around 35 at the highest. Okay, that's in terms of construction costs.
Fair.
Building on what the other commissioner has just said, if all you're asking for is $24,000 in lieu fees, then whether it's $35,000 or $80,000 to build that spot, you're shortchanging the city, and we're potentially going to be faced with having to pay way more for a parking spot that we gave away.
Well, let me just make a comment on that. I appreciate the math, but the way the math works, but there's a different way the math works. You're absolutely right about the construction cost versus the total cost, including land. But there's another way that this works. When the city builds a parking space, when a housing developer builds a parking space in his garage for the use of his residents, that parking space has one user, period. When the city builds a parking space if they add a level to the orange garage and they add parking to the orange garage, that parking space is shared among many users. That parking space is not assigned to anyone. So you never have to recover one for one from an in lieu fee to building a parking space, because a parking space is used very differently. I don't think there's a single example of all those cities that actually recoup the cost of building a new parking space on a one-to-one from a developer.
And I wouldn't suggest one-to-one. I'm saying that it's still too broad a spectrum. Your comments are right on. I understand what you're saying about that. But yeah, I still think it's
You think that number's too low?
I'm sorry, just two quick questions on the specifics. The one thing that we're being asked to do is change parking exemptions from 2,000 up to 5,000. What kind of inventory are we talking there? How many buildings? How many stores or spaces?
Emil might know for that.
I hate this. Things change for like 3 properties. Yeah.
Well, we do have, I wish I could quantify it for you, but we do have a sizable number of applicants that go through the process when they're only 2,000 square feet, and we have to process parking exceptions for them. And it's become a standard routine. We at least have 1 or 2 a month. But I don't know where the threshold is. And I think we did look at some inventory. I have to go back. This is almost 2 years ago, and unfortunately, I can't recall what the quantity was in terms of the square footage that would benefit from this. But that is a good question we should follow up on.
Okay. Yeah, it would be nice to have that kind of, again, empirical data. And the only other one I have, and I promise I'll let other people continue with their questioning, is 3.2, which is part of your robust menu. Allowed for shared parking as of right, and you paint I think this is the one where you paint the rosy picture of, the daytime use versus nighttime use, whether it's like restaurant and dentist office or whatever.
Right.
That works great as long as it's a dentist office and a restaurant. What happens to that situation when suddenly it becomes restaurant, where the use of one is no longer that rosy picture, but now is in conflict?
So what if you had a shared parking agreement with your neighbor next door, and the bank that I was talking about that shares with the restaurant goes out of business, and instead they want to build another restaurant there?
Right.
Okay. Well, they have an agreement. The agreement is a legal document. It's like a lease, and it has a period of time associated with it. And the new owner of that land, of that building, is required to service that lease. You might require that if your developer has to come to you with a shared parking arrangement, that it has to be a 50-year lease, for example. Could there be a situation where a shared parking agreement, when a lease is up, when an agreement is up, when a new use falls apart? Yes, that could happen. What happens then? Well, you're going to have to find another shared use partner. You're going to have to perhaps rent some monthly parking spaces in one of the city garages. That's being done now in some cases. You're going to have to find another arrangement. Those things do fall apart, but not often. But you're right. There's a possibility that at the end of a lease, at the end of an agreement period, you might not be able to renew a shared parking agreement.
And that's why I get concerned about of right. When the city doesn't have a chance to step in and control it in some way. A 50-year lease doesn't sound very practical to me, but I suppose it can always be mandated. Other questions, comments, input of the speaker? Mr. Sheets.
Just a couple comments. You can clear my thinking.
I'll try.
about them. That's fine. If not, it's more just to get the thoughts out about the whole issue. Thinking practically about Glendale, none of this goes quickly. And I see my sense of the whole process right now as we're talking about the process is going to take transition of some period. I don't know what that looks like or sounds like, but I sense it'll be a good while. During that period, what's your sense on the impact of business if we start minimizing parking, allowing developments to occur with less parking requirements? What do you think the impact will be on businesses during that transition?
Well, I would word your question a little bit differently, which is there something, are there some things that we can do faster than others? And because you don't want there to be negative impacts, of course. Going from 2,000 to 5,000, I think, would be extremely helpful and would actually be a plus for development because on the square footage for reuse, because, and I wish I could remember the number, there are a significant number of buildings on brand that are in that 2,000 to 5,000 range, where developers have come to the city talking about restaurants, talking about coffee houses, talking about uses that the city really wants to have happen, but those buildings don't have parking, and becomes very complicated to do. Doing just that would be a win-win. I would think, almost, I was going to say a no-brainer, but I don't like that term. But a win-win for everybody. The reductions that we're talking about are relatively small, and what they would do is they would remove a significant number of exceptions from coming to you. And right now, the reductions that we are proposing in the first group of recommendations, actual reductions in the code, really reflect what you're doing anyway, but you're doing it by exception rather than by right. So I don't see any impact in making those changes. The others, allowing an in lieu fee, if you did it, maybe if you implemented it slowly in a more controlled way so that you can use the in lieu fee, but only for 20% of your spaces, or only, so you're implementing slowly, at least you're not giving parking away. That's what you're doing right now, is you're getting an exception request, you're granting them 99 times out of 100, and you're with no cost to the developer, nothing gained by the city, less parking implemented, but you still have your high parking requirements. It doesn't add up to me. I'm not seeing a lot of risk. You're right, Glendale is an implement slowly kind of a place. We've been doing this since 2007. I've been, and we've implemented big pieces, but we still have a ways to go. And I think you could do it in a way that you could really test and monitor and measure and not go too far too fast.
Thank you. I have a block about this whole concept. Not that it's not the way to go, but having lived in this city a long time and having seen numerous iterations and reiterations of parking, how we park, when we park, diagonal parking, not diagonal, will we charge, won't we charge, frustrates me, causes me to not be happy with that and not want to frequent the areas. I know numerous other people that live in the city that don't want to go downtown, and I know friends from out of the city. So what I'm trying to get through is we have people right now that are having parking issues. When we go through this whole process, what do we do with them? What do we make? What's going to make them? Is not by fixing parking. It's not going to fix it.
Well,
what do we do to make the people?
You raise a really good point.
And where are we going to put the cars?
It's a funny thing. you say there are people who won't come downtown because there's no place to park, and yet Commissioner Kane says, I want empirical data, and I say, I've counted the cars, I can tell you, those people who aren't coming downtown because there's no parking, that's not the reason they're not coming downtown. There's parking. There may not be parking exactly where they want it to be. There may not be parking in front of the store they want to park at. In fact, there's more parking now on Brand than there was before.
See, so the issue is, what needs to change in our city that makes the plan you're talking about, or the potential plans, be comprehensive, be in the right place? I mean, there are so many pieces to the puzzle that have to move to get to where we want to go, and it'll never be easy and never be perfect, but if they're not coming now, is this all it's going to take? Traffic management, parking management, is that all it's going to take to make them come? Or is there something else that needs to be incorporated in it that makes the parking issue, the parking plans be successful? If you see where I'm coming from.
I think so. A lot of what happens when we study parking is counterintuitive. The idea that charging for parking makes parking more available, which you heard Professor Shoup talk about. I joke that, he's treated like he invented relativity or something, and, the idea that charging for a scarce resource, the law of supply and demand will work, was not all that complicated. But he was the first one to articulate that. And it's proven to be absolutely true on Brand. And yet, you had people that said, if you charge for parking on Brand Boulevard, people just are going to stop coming. People come downtown because they can park for free and go where they want to go. Well, no. We have the empirical data. You are at 103% occupancy on Brand Boulevard. Every space full, and people parked illegally. People were waiting for those diagonal spaces. People were blocking traffic lanes, waiting for someone to back out because they wanted that spot. That is not the case now. The parking meters may only have been one part of that, but the parking meters have helped to really make that happen. So there's a fear in change, but I don't think anything that we have recommended is likely to have an impact where people will stop coming downtown. I don't think so. The other thing I think is important is one of the things we have learned recently in transportation engineering is that parking is at the root of traffic in so many ways. That parking is, it's catnip to cars, right? And it draws cars, and people circulate to look for parking. And to the extent that you can organize and manage and have a proper management structure on your parking, you actually make your downtown more livable. You actually make your downtown more walkable. And other cities have done it. I don't know. I don't have the magic bullet for you, but I do feel confident that you can implement this in a way that will take some of the worry out.
Let me interject on a couple things, just as we continue through the process. I want everyone to continue with their thoughts. Staff in our charge this evening has said that they're requesting input and direction from the various commissioners. Are you expecting that input and direction as a process at the end of this session, or is this something you're going to take to us in successive meetings?
If both commissions are inclined to give us a formal set of input and comment at the end, that will work fine. Otherwise, we will gather up the comments that you give us as a sense of where you're standing, the level of skepticism you may have, etc. But it would definitely help if you could give us a set of formal comments at the end.
Okay, well, with that process in mind, I think realizing it's going to be a continuing process over the months, what I'd like to suggest is that we kind of just go in sequence, and whatever you'd like to say, if you want to continue asking questions from the speaker, if you want to share your opinion on the various things we've been charged, let's just kind of rotate across the dais and kind of make those statements known, and then we can conclude the evening if it's appropriate. For the record, though, before we did it, we did have one speaker card. It was from Mr. Mike Mohill. He left, but he left a communication in his stead. Each of us has been provided a copy of it. It'll be part of the public record. I won't bother reading it into it. But just as a general statement, he is against easing, in his terms, please do not ease the parking requirements for the city. We already have major congestion in South Glendale. So now that said, may I suggest that we just start with our thoughts?
Well, should I reiterate? I have just two points that I touched upon today during this presentation. One is my big concern for the spillover effect into the neighborhoods that are already ready to explode with their capacity. I'd like to see whatever we implement to have the least detrimental effect on those communities. If that means dealing with that with the residential parking issue first, and then dealing with this second, as was proposed, doing it in like steps, I would be all for that. My second concern was the issue of the in lieu fees, not having the City of Glendale in any shape or form give an indirect subsidy to these developers if they do choose to take that in lieu fee instead of putting in those parking spaces. And then I would like the money or a portion of it or some part of it to be put back into the improving of our public transportation in downtown Glendale.
Thank you.
Okay. Ditto on those two items. My approach to this is, what's our vision for downtown Glendale? I mean, looking 10, 15, 20 years from now, looking at the SCAG reports, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, what do we want? Do we want this vibrant downtown, pet-friendly, business-friendly, or a more dormant downtown is what's acceptable to this community? We're in a recession. I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, honestly, within the next year or two. Are we trying to attract more developers to the city, and our existing vacancy rate is already way too high? What are we trying to accomplish? Now, putting those all aside, human behavior need to change to be able to accommodate these parking proposals. No ifs and buts about it. These are new developments. They're going to attract new tenants. These new tenants are going to be told that you have a two-bedroom apartment, you can park only one vehicle. Now, is that going to impact the occupancy of that residential building? Or if a business is told that, yeah, you're a restaurant, but you're going to share your parking with this bank that's 2 blocks away. Are they going to feel that that's going to impact the number of people coming to their business, and how are they going to conduct their business? Having said all that, I think the key is TDM and TMA. Honestly, I don't know what's the membership in the city of Glendale as far as TMA. I do agree with the chair that we don't have transit hubs here. A bus stop is not a transit hub. It's as simple as that. So for me to support the idea, even if the figures are showing it, that if within a quarter of a mile there's a transit hub, the vehicle trips will go down, parking demand will go down. Yes, they will go down, but the bus stops on Colorado, Brand, Central are not transit hubs. It's as simple as that. The 2,000 to 5,000 square feet, I don't think that's going to have a major impact. Honestly, I can understand that. I do have a concern with the number of guest parking, the ratio 10 to 1. I've been studying similar developments in the Hollywood area, and I can tell you for a fact that that's a very small number. Very small number. So that needs to be looked at. And also a big concern as far as the 24,000, was it 24,000 or 34,000? 34,000 figure.
24,000.
If the city is going to take that money and planning to build parking lot in the future, which will probably cost double 5-10 years from now, that's not going to work. It's just not going to work. Now, if we're going to take that money and put it into TDM programs and TMA programs and ride sharing and alternative work schedules, van pooling, and what have you, yes, that might complement the plan. But I think the most important thing that we should look into is to create a transit hub within the CBD area. We need a connector that goes to one of the other transit hubs, and from there you take the Gold Line, the Red Line, the subway, North Hollywood. Without that transit hub, it's just not going to happen.
Thank you.
I'll be succinct. I agree with the report. I think I agree with my commissioner's comments in the sense that I think the in-lieu fee has to benefit the neighborhoods, so there isn't this sort of subsidy of developers but not of the neighbors. And I think this is, my concern on a lot of these things has been, we are betwixt and between. We don't, sort of West LA is the worst of both worlds. We have semi-dense, but we have no transit. I think this is a measured path to get to where I would like to go, which is a vibrant, dense downtown. So, and I think the increments, as the consultant was saying, we're already doing this in many ways. We're just doing it unorganized and an uneconomic fashion. So, I endorse the report with special attention to the surrounding neighborhood.
I agree. I endorse the report. I think that this is really, in my mind, just step 2 on our path for the long-term mobility plan for the city. So I definitely support that. I also concur with my fellow commissioners. We need a major transit system, some kind of tie-in to light rail or heavy rail or whatnot. I would just caution that the specifics of how that parking is done for residential needs to be very tightly written, and it has to be, at least one parking space for every unit that is developed in the downtown core, and that this only be applicable to the downtown core. I think the rest of the city needs to be, excluded from any of this consideration. It is just specifically for the downtown core. So.
Well, I don't want to start sounding like a broken record, but I'm also generally in agreement with the recommendations from the report, and I think it does tie in with what we've heard from other sources, such as Professor Shoup and his studies of market rate pricing for parking. For me, the high-level start for this is really the mobility plan and the downtown-specific plan. There's the high-level language in there talks about having walkable downtown, having a vibrant downtown, having shops and restaurants that can be accessed without necessarily having to get in and out of your vehicle and looking for a parking space. I'm also in agreement with the idea that we don't have a transit hub in the downtown-specific plan area, as Commissioner Sahakian said, and that something along those lines is going to be a prerequisite for the success of any mobility planning that we do. To some extent, the devil is in the details. Some of the things I've heard today that I have concerns about are the amount of the in-lieu fee. I think there's going to have some thought and discussion go into that for the reasons that have already been mentioned. One of the other things that I was a little bit concerned about was the see if I can find it here. The proposed reductions in parking minimums for selected land uses. For multifamily, retail, office, and medical dental, they're really not too far different from what we have currently. The thing that I had a little bit of concern about was the bars and taverns, nightclubs, and restaurants. The proposed versus the existing standards are, in some cases, fairly dramatically different. So I'm not saying I think that's a problem. I just would have a little bit of concern that we would need to look at those numbers to make sure they make sense for Glendale. And I think it will be a big boon for developers to be able to give them some certainty in terms of parking. I know one of the things that Professor Shoup has talked about is that in an environment where you have a fair market price for parking in the area, you can eliminate these minimum requirements. You can tell the developer, you figure out how many parking spaces your building needs. We're not going to tell you you need 10 or 20 or 30 for however many thousand square feet. You know, like the line is from, Indiana Jones, he chose unwisely, right? If you choose unwisely in the amount of parking spaces you put in your building, it's not going to be a viable development. And the last thing I would mention also, as has been previously mentioned by other commissioners, we absolutely have to have a robust TDM and TMA program. I believe the membership does need to be mandatory in order to give the TMA folks the critical mass they're going to need to implement something like this. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you.
Okay. Just a couple quick items. For me, enforcement is an item that we didn't talk a lot about, but I think in our community it's critical. And the effect of not enforcing would have a domino effect, which I think could get out of control. So I think that's important. I think that the overflow in the neighborhood is an issue that is extremely critical. If you live in neighborhoods here and you see how difficult the parking is and how standards of 1.25 and 2 are so far off as far as how many cars people have in neighborhoods. And it has nothing to do with pay scale or anything. People just have a lot of cars in this community. So I almost feel that that's an issue that could be looked at separately or looked at it in greater detail before we make a decision of what the impact is going to be to those neighborhoods. And I'm looking at this from a local standpoint, from people that live in the city, and I know there's a larger component of people that will use the city, come to the city from outside. But I have a thought that may be way off, but I'm not so sure that developers wouldn't take every parking or lack of parking requirement that we would give them, and then let the city worry about where they're going to park. I know that's pretty extreme, but I think that they would try to get as many parking exemptions as they could. So that's just a thought. I think there's an education process that needs to go on in the community to make us understand why these things are changing, because they're changing. And a lot of us have lived here, and they've been a certain way for a long period of time. And I guess the last thing I would say is I always have a fear when these new ideas come in place, and I'm progressive. I can be as progressive as the next person, but and I worry about this with the bike issue. I don't want us to try to be something we're not. I'm not sure what we want to be, and I know we have an issue with that, but my fear is if we try to be something we're not and try to throw everything on the wall, you know what that makes. So my comment and advice is proceed with caution and clear thought. This is very important.
Thank you.
I think mostly we're in agreement that what we want in downtown is more intensity of uses, and as we saw earlier, the presentations from Mr. Lomas on the type of art districts and possibilities that we can have in downtown are exciting, and they seem like are the right steps to take in order to get to those points. The concerns, I think a lot of people have the same concerns, and I think there's a lot of good recommendations in this report, especially with how to handle spillover effects to neighborhoods. And I think going forward, it would be essential to do a comprehensive rule or recommendation to implement, especially with the PPDs, and not to just leave it for one district, but as more of a holistic approach going forward. And I don't know the one example that was brought up with it was okay as far as the parking meters go, and it didn't really affect the neighborhoods. I'm not sure if that's quite the most valid example, because these are much more intense changes that will happen. So going forward, probably a more comprehensive approach would make sense. But I think generally this is what we need in order to get the vision that was laid out to us earlier today.
Lonergan? I didn't know if you were pausing.
Oh,
All right.
I didn't either. In general, I was very impressed with the studies and the recommendations. I have several concerns. One is that parking is not a solo act, and cars are not a solo component of the problem. And so I think that we need to have a little more holistic solution proposed at the same time, so that if we were going to implement this, I would encourage us to have a combination of other issues that are implemented at the same time, such as in Seattle and Portland. Part of the success of what is happening there is they have a free zone, and if we use the downtown specific plan as a free zone and increase the amount of public transportation there at the same time that we impose these or allow the changes in the parking, then I think that that's a realistic response to how to deal with some of the issues that we've talked about here. So I don't think we should address this as only a parking space issue, but it has to be a parking circulation issue and a pedestrian moving issue. Secondly, I would say that I would also encourage us at the same time for the city to take the initiative and provide a shared parking, a shared car facility such as Zipcar. If they did it at the city, they would put in an area where you could get shared cars that would already be here, so that that would set a precedent and that we would have that in place. We would find out the viability of it so that when we implement it, we have these other alternatives that we have, we're asking others to impose, that we, the city, take some of the initiative in this, and those in lieu fees pay for that. I also totally agree that the TDM and the TMA should be mandatory. And I am concerned about enforcement in residential developments. It's one thing to enforce something in a commercial or another area where you can throw out a business, but when you're throwing out folks from their homes, or you can't. So that implication there to me is something that needs to be a little further fleshed out for me to feel comfortable with. And lastly, I do feel the neighborhood PPDs, is that right, the preferential parking districts, that the neighborhood should not be the stepchild of development here, and that the in lieu fees should somehow be applied so that they are first applied in an affected radius if there is a neighborhood there, so that there is some monetary subsidy or help for these neighborhoods in some of these areas where there will not be the economic ability for people to absorb that impact. And those are the issues that I have.
Right, thank you. Well, for me, and you're hearing it from several of the other commissioners, I mean, we're focusing, fortunately, on just the downtown specific plan area, but a lot of our remarks filter out into areas beyond that. So part of the process to me is if we want to experiment a little bit with these changes, I'd like to make sure that the downtown specific plan is kind of in a virtual moat or a friendship ditch, to quote a movie line, that within this friendship ditch, the parking issues that it may be created don't spread out into the neighborhoods, because none of us want to see that. That's just a no-win. I think I have real concern about the minimum parking requirements, adjusting it for residential, but a lot of it is coming from the prejudices of me living, me being the age I am, me living in the house in the neighborhood I live in, and so on. downtown specific plan is going to be a different type of person. I mean, I've seen it building lofts downtown. It's just a different type of person. So as the units are added, as different things come online, the people that are going to move in are just going to live differently than I live and than most of us live. So we're planning for them. So that's kind of exciting. I mean, it'll be fun to park a mile from town and take the bus downtown and go to the nightclub or something when I'm 70. So in general, I mean, this is obviously it's all really positive stuff we're dealing with. What we're worrying about is just not impacting the present. So I'm concerned about lowering some of those minimum requirements, especially related to residential. But it triggers with what are people going to do, the next generation that moves in. Raising the parking exemptions just seems to make sense. I describe it to raising the speed limit on a street. If everybody's driving 40, if you're getting exemption after exemption after exemption, month after month, it seems wise to adjust it, especially since they're pretty much all being granted anyway. The TDM, the TMA, and all the other acronyms we've been tossing around, just a great process, and that gives staff and the city a lot of flexibility in terms of finding creative solutions, because none of us really know what'll work, and every building and every block will have different solutions. And then the only other thing I get concerned about in my final remark is some of the things that they're talking about as, by right. And shared parking by right, tandem parking by right, I get really nervous that that's going to paint us into a corner. Because even as the consultant says, you're not going to add another floor of parking to a building if you find out you've created a problem. Any other comments? Has anybody thought of anything in the process that they'd like to add? Certainly want to have everyone that sat through this the opportunity to be heard. Okay. Well, if not,
one comment,
please.
Chair, is that my mind is at ease knowing that we're dealing with one of the most reputable companies in the nation. I'm a transportation engineer myself, and I've seen their work. So in that sense, honestly, they don't do too many mistakes. They just present the facts. So that's a big plus.
That's good to hear. Well, to me, it's just been a great process. So I've enjoyed, sitting in with our fellow commissioners, especially on, shared ground. It's great to hear your focused, expertise and concerns. So I'm glad that staff put this together. I think it's been a benefit for both our commissions, hopefully for the public. Unless somebody wants to add something, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I moved.
I'd say we're adjourned.